The Senate chamber was already tense, but when Chuck Schumer rose to speak, the air seemed to thicken. Reporters leaned forward, pens hovering above notebooks, cameras zoomed in, and the chatter hushed into silence. Then, in a voice that carried the weight of decades of political battles, Schumer declared, "If the government shuts down, the American people will blame Donald Trump." For a moment, time froze. Gasps rippled across the chamber. Some Republicans shifted in their seats, exchanging uneasy glances. Staffers whispered frantically, fingers flying across phone screens as the quote spread like wildfire. It wasn't just another political jab. It was a direct warning, an indictment, a spotlight, a line destined to echo beyond these marble walls. Within seconds, news alerts lit up across the country. Push notifications flashed on smartphones in coffee shops, subway cars, and late-night diners. The words "Blame Trump" trended on social media before the echoes had even faded from the chamber walls. Ordinary Americans scrolled in disbelief, some nodding with vindication, others seething with rage. The line had pierced through the noise of politics and landed where it mattered most, on the conscience of the nation. Schumer's tone was not reckless anger. It was deliberate, calculated, almost surgical. He wasn't just speaking to his colleagues across the aisle. He was speaking directly to the American people, to the families living paycheck to paycheck, to federal workers dreading another furlough, to immigrants who knew too well what political chaos could cost. He positioned himself as the voice of dignity in a chamber clouded by posturing and gamesmanship. But for Republicans, especially those tethered tightly to Trump's shadow, the statement landed like a bomb. To them, it wasn't just a warning, it was a threat to their political survival. And in that instant, the chamber no longer felt like a legislative hall. It felt like an arena, a stage where every move would be scrutinized, replayed, and remembered. The clash lines had been drawn with a single sentence. It was more than politics. It was a fight over who would carry the blame, who would claim the mantle of truth, and who would be left exposed when the storm hit. But what pushed Schumer to deliver such a direct threat would leave even seasoned politicians stunned. Long before Schumer's words pierced the chamber, a darker reality had been closing in on the nation. The clock was ticking toward a government shutdown, and with each hour the threat felt less like a headline and more like a storm about to crash over millions of ordinary lives. Washington buzzed with blame games, but outside the Capitol walls, the consequences were terrifyingly real. Federal employees counted down the days, wondering how they would pay rent if their checks vanished overnight. Families who lived paycheck to paycheck faced the thought of empty refrigerators and unpaid bills. Small towns that depended on government contracts braced for layoffs, knowing that once the pay stopped, the ripple effects would spread like cracks through glass. Markets shuddered with nervous energy. Investors spoke in whispers about uncertainty, while economists warned of damage that could take years to undo. Airports prepared for longer security lines as TSA workers debated how long they could keep showing up without pay. National parks that symbolized America's beauty stood on the brink of shuttering, locking out families who had planned long-awaited visits. Even military families, already carrying the weight of sacrifice, feared being dragged into yet another financial standoff they had no power to control. It wasn't just economics. It was dignity. It was stability. The image of America itself was on trial. Around the world, allies and adversaries alike watched closely. Would the United States once again stumble into dysfunction, or could its leaders prove worthy of the responsibility that comes with being a democracy others look to, for example? Every delay, every press conference, every hostile remark chipped away at the idea that America could govern itself with strength and clarity. And while Republicans insisted they were holding the line for principle, ordinary citizens saw something else. They saw chaos packaged as strategy. They saw brinkmanship dressed up as leadership. For parents working double shifts, for immigrants striving to make a better life, for seniors relying on Social Security checks, this wasn't a political chess match, it was survival. Meanwhile, the halls of Congress throbbed with tension. Staffers carried folders stuffed with last-minute proposals. Senators huddled in private rooms, and yet no real progress emerged. The air smelled of panic disguised as procedure. Reporters rushed between briefings, each new update bleaker than the last. The closer the shutdown loomed, the more the weight of responsibility pressed down on every word, every decision. And beneath it all, One figure dominated the conversation. He was not physically present in the chamber that day, yet his shadow loomed over every speech, every whisper, every calculation. And as the countdown ticked, one name kept echoing in the halls of power. To understand the weight of Schumer's warning, you have to step into the mindset of the opposition, the Republican Party bound tightly, almost obsessively, to Donald Trump. For years, Trump had reshaped the GOP in his own image, combative, defiant, allergic to compromise. What once was a party of cautious conservatism had morphed into a stage for loyalty tests and political theater. And when the threat of a shutdown emerged, that culture of confrontation only deepened. The GOP strategy wasn't about finding solutions. It was about wielding power like a weapon. Instead of negotiating, leaders postured. Instead of seeking stability, they embraced brinkmanship. Trump, though no longer seated in the Oval Office, pulled the strings with every Truth Social post, every rally rant, every whisper to his loyalists in Congress. His message was clear: fight, obstruct, dominate, or risk being cast out as weak. And so Republicans hardened their stance. They spoke of fiscal responsibility while ignoring the human toll. They warned of bloated government while relying on the very systems that kept their own districts alive. It was a contradiction that ordinary Americans could see plainly, yet one the GOP brushed aside in favor of applause lines and sound bites. For them, the shutdown wasn't a disaster to avoid. It was leverage to be exploited. This wasn't the first time Trump's shadow had pushed the government to the brink. The nation remembered the shutdowns of years past. Federal workers lining up at food banks, children missing out on school lunches, veterans wondering when benefits would return. Those wounds had barely healed, yet here was the GOP, ready to reopen them as if suffering were just another bargaining chip. What made it worse was the arrogance. Leaders appeared on television grinning, as if the looming shutdown were a game. They boasted about standing firm against the left, painting Democrats as reckless spenders while refusing to admit that their own intransigence risked national stability. Trump's allies framed him as a warrior battling for the forgotten American, yet the people most hurt by these shutdowns were those very same working families, truck drivers, single mothers, immigrants chasing the dream of security. And beneath every speech, every press conference, every smug soundbite lingered a truth they could not escape. Their strategy was built not on vision, but on chaos. By tying themselves so tightly to Trump, Republicans traded policy for personality, governance for grievance. They had become a party orbiting one man's ego, and that orbit was pulling them closer to collapse. Americans could sense it. In town halls and community centers, in coffee shops and factory floors, the frustration grew louder. Why were elected leaders willing to gamble with paychecks, with mortgages, with lives? Why did the GOP seem more committed to defending Trump's pride than protecting the people they swore to represent? Each contradiction fed the anger. Each refusal to compromise sharpened the sense that this was no longer politics as usual, but a dangerous experiment with real human costs. The GOP wrapped itself in slogans about freedom, but their actions shackled ordinary Americans to uncertainty. They claimed to defend democracy, but their loyalty to one man revealed something else entirely: a hunger for control, no matter the cost. And so, as the shutdown loomed closer, the villain's role became unmistakable. Trump's voice, amplified by his allies, was less a guide than a demand. Dig in, escalate, refuse. It was arrogance dressed as courage, power plays masquerading as leadership. The Republican Party wasn't just risking the nation's stability, it was daring the American people to endure the consequences of their games. But while the GOP leaned on chaos, one man had been preparing for this showdown his entire career. To grasp why Chuck Schumer's warning carried such power, you have to look beyond the Senate floor and into the story of the man himself, a story shaped not by privilege or smooth pathways, but by grit, scars, and an unshakable belief in service. Schumer was born and raised in Brooklyn, New York, the son of an exterminator and a homemaker. His childhood wasn't gilded by wealth or connections. It was defined by the same pressures millions of working-class families faced: tight budgets, endless hustle, and the knowledge that every opportunity had to be earned. That background gave him something Washington often lacks: perspective. He understood from an early age what it meant to struggle, to worry about bills, to watch neighbors fight for dignity in the face of hardship. From those streets of Brooklyn, he carried forward a commitment to fight for ordinary families. While some politicians treated power as theater, Schumer treated it as responsibility. He earned scholarships, excelled at Harvard, and could have chosen a lucrative career in law. Instead, he turned to public service, an act that puzzled many but revealed his true compass. For Schumer, success wasn't measured by titles or wealth. It was measured by whether he could ease the burdens of the people who raised him. His rise in politics was not smooth. Time and again he walked into bruising battles on healthcare, on education, on workers' rights. Each fight left him tougher, sharper, more determined. He became known not for flashy speeches but for strategy, for knowing when to hold firm and when to strike with precision. Where others sought cameras, Schumer sought results. And behind every negotiation, every late-night session was the boy from Brooklyn who had seen too many families left behind. Over the years, those scars multiplied. He faced government shutdowns before. He saw what happened when paychecks stopped, when families panicked, when America's image cracked under the weight of dysfunction. He carried those memories like armor. They hardened his resolve, sharpened his instincts, and taught him a crucial lesson. Chaos always comes with a cost, and someone must be willing to stand against it. Schumer's style was never to shout the loudest. Instead, he wielded patience as a weapon. He listened, calculated, waited for openings. Allies described him as relentless, not because he enjoyed the fight, but because he knew lives depended on the outcome. That quiet persistence built him a reputation, the man who could endure storms without breaking. But make no mistake, he was not flawless. Critics called him too cautious, too institutional, too invested in the traditions of the Senate. There were moments when progressives demanded he push harder, when skeptics wondered if he could truly stand firm against the fury of Trump and his allies. Yet what separated Schumer from his opponents was not perfection, but principle. Even in his missteps, there was a thread of dignity, an understanding that politics wasn't a game but a trust placed in him by millions. That trust defined his leadership. For immigrants hoping for protection, for families desperate for affordable health care, for workers clinging to jobs in uncertain times, Schumer became a steady, if sometimes quiet, defender. He was not the firebrand shaking his fist for headlines. He was the strategist, the survivor, the man willing to take blows if it meant shielding those who couldn't fight back. And so, when the specter of another government shutdown rose, it wasn't just another policy debate to him. It was personal. He had lived through the fallout, seen the suffering, carried the scars. This time he knew the stakes were larger than partisan advantage. This was about whether America could still trust its leaders to put people before ego, stability before chaos. That is why, on that fateful day, Schumer's voice carried such weight. It wasn't the sound of a politician playing to the cameras. It was the sound of a man who had spent a lifetime preparing for this moment. A man who embodied resilience not as an act, but as his very nature. He wasn't simply speaking as majority leader. He was speaking as the boy from Brooklyn who had seen hardship, as the public servant who had endured countless battles, as the strategist who knew when to strike. He was speaking as the embodiment of principle standing against arrogance, of dignity standing against chaos. And when the moment finally came, Schumer didn't just speak, he detonated. The chamber was packed, but the mood was anything but routine. Murmurs buzzed like static electricity, staffers shuffling nervously, reporters craning for vantage points. The air felt heavy, like a storm waiting to break. On one side of the aisle, GOP lawmakers sharpened their talking points into weapons. On the other, Democrats held their breath, their eyes fixed on the man who carried their hopes into the ring. The first jab came quick. A Republican voice thundered across the chamber, mocking Democrats as reckless obstructionists willing to plunge the nation into chaos. Heads nodded among their ranks, fists tapped against desks for emphasis. The performance was brash, designed to intimidate, and it worked on some. A few gasps rippled in the gallery. But Schumer didn't flinch. He sat back, glasses glinting under the lights, his pen tapping once, twice, like a general waiting for the precise moment to move his troops. Another Republican piled on, accusing Democrats of holding paychecks hostage, weighing of playing politics with families' futures. The words struck with the force of a blunt instrument. The chamber grew louder, voices colliding, a cacophony of blame. Reporters' fingers blurred across keyboards, notifications pinging from every corner as headlines began to form in real time. Social media lit up with fragments. Shutdown fight explodes. Schumer under fire, GOP hardens line. Then Schumer rose. The noise dipped instantly like a referee stepping between fighters. His posture was steady, his tone deliberate. "You talk about families' futures," he said, his voice carrying just enough steel to cut through the heckling. "But you're the ones ready to gamble their paychecks to score points with one man in Mar-a-Lago." A gasp sliced through the room. The jab had landed. Cameras flashed like lightning bolts, freezing expressions mid-reaction. Republicans bristled, some leaning forward in protest, others whispering with clenched jaws. The back and forth intensified. GOP leaders hurled accusations of weakness, of betrayal of American values. Schumer countered, never raising his volume, but each word crafted like a scalpel, drawing blood where bluster had only bruised. It was less a debate and more a duel. Sweat beading on brows, hands slamming on desks. The chamber transformed into an arena where the stakes were nothing less than the country's direction. And then, just as the shouting reached its peak, the room fell into a suspended silence. All eyes locked on Schumer as he leaned into the microphone. His lips curved into a line equal parts resolve and warning. But then, Schumer's words sliced through the noise, a mic drop line that froze the entire chamber. The silence was so sharp it seemed to ring. For a heartbeat, the chamber held its breath. Every eye locked on Schumer. He didn't rush. He let the weight of the moment swell, as if he knew that the pause itself was part of the strike. Cameras zoomed, pens hovered above notepads. Staffers leaned forward in their seats. Then, in a voice neither raised nor trembling, Schumer said it. "The American people will blame Trump." The words dropped like stone into water, sending ripples that hit every corner of the chamber. There was no need for thunder, no pounding fist, no theatrics. Just calm precision, the kind that cuts deeper than shouting ever could. Gasps burst from the gallery. Reporters nearly leapt out of their seats, typing furiously, knowing they'd just heard the line that would define the night. On the GOP side, faces tightened instantly. Some flinched as if struck. Others masked their anger behind smirks that fooled no one. The arrogance that had carried their barbs a moment earlier seemed suddenly brittle, fragile against the clarity of that single sentence. One Republican tried to laugh it off, muttering, "We'll see about that," but his voice wavered, and the microphones caught it. Another leaned to a colleague, whispering harshly, eyes darting toward the press gallery. They knew how headlines would read. Schumer didn't gloat. He didn't need to. His expression was steady, almost solemn, as though he understood the gravity of what he had unleashed. He wasn't just speaking to the chamber. He was speaking to the American worker watching their savings drain, to the parent worrying about rent, to the soldier unsure if a paycheck would arrive. His line carried their anger, their exhaustion, their demand for accountability. On the Democratic side, the mood shifted from anxious to electric. Shoulders straightened, lips curled into restrained smiles. It was as if they all felt the same shiver of vindication. For once, it wasn't just defense, it was counterattack. And it landed with surgical accuracy. Reporters' phones buzzed with push notifications. Schumer to GOP. "The American people will blame Trump." Cable news chyrons began to scroll within minutes. Tweets went viral before Schumer had even sat down. The chamber became not just a battleground but a broadcast studio, amplifying the blow in real time. Across the aisle, Republicans scrambled. One after another, they attempted to drown him out with bluster. They claimed Americans would blame Democrats. They tried to pivot to immigration, to spending, to anything but the truth that had just been spoken aloud. But their voices sounded thinner now, forced, almost desperate. The dignity of Schumer's calm had made their fury look small. Staffers exchanged looks that told the story. Even seasoned operatives, hardened by years of partisan warfare, felt the tremor in the air. They knew a line like this doesn't fade. It embeds itself in the public's memory, replayed again and again on loop, turning into a symbol larger than the moment itself. The contrast was glaring. On one side, red faces, veins bulging, hands slamming. On the other, a man standing still, glasses catching the light, words delivered like a verdict. It was dignity overwhelming arrogance in real time, and the chamber knew it. For a brief second, no one dared move. Even the echoes of shuffling papers seemed inappropriate. That's the kind of silence usually reserved for verdicts, funerals, or victories. In that instant, Schumer's line had become all three. A Democratic aide whispered almost reverently, "That's it. That's the clip." And she was right. The sentence would outlive the shouting, outlast the fury, echo far beyond the chamber walls. But Schumer didn't look triumphant. He simply gathered his papers, nodded once toward the dais, and sat. His restraint was the exclamation mark. He had detonated the line, and he knew its aftershocks would be louder than anything left to say. Republicans exchanged frantic glances, their coordinated defiance beginning to fray. They could already feel the story slipping out of their control. The chamber, once roaring with their accusations, now seemed haunted by the echo of those 8 words. And beyond those walls, America was already reacting. Clips were spreading, commentators were cutting into live broadcasts, hashtags were forming, memes being drafted. The court of public opinion was opening for business, and the verdict would not be kind to Trump or his loyalists. But what happened after those words spread beyond the chamber was even more shocking. The clip traveled faster than wildfire. Before Schumer had even left the chamber, CNN was already rolling the moment on loop. A bold headline scrolled across the bottom of the screen: "Schumer to GOP, Americans will blame Trump." Pundits cut into their programming mid-sentence, voices tinged with the excitement of knowing history had just been made. On MSNBC, analysts replayed the pause before Schumer's words, dissecting the silence as though it were choreography. They leaned in, calling it a masterclass in restraint, the pivot point of the shutdown battle. One anchor declared, this wasn't just politics, this was a cultural line in the sand. Fox News hosts scrambled to contain the blow. Some tried to laugh it off, painting Schumer as theatrical. Others pivoted hard, insisting Democrats were the true villains of the standoff. But their voices carried a faint edge of panic, as if they knew the narrative had slipped beyond their grasp. Meanwhile, late-night comedians smelled blood. Within hours, monologues were drafted. Stephen Colbert joked about GOP leaders frantically Googling, "Will Americans actually blame Trump?" Trevor Noah mimicked the frozen faces of Republicans caught on camera, quipping that they looked like kids told Santa's gone bankrupt. The laughter stitched Schumer's line even deeper into the fabric of popular culture. On Twitter, hashtags exploded: blame Trump, shutdown Showdown, Mic drop Schumer. Memes flooded timelines. One showed Schumer as a Jedi Master delivering the final blow to a flailing Sith. Another cut the moment to dramatic music, turning it into a viral TikTok reel. Young activists stitched the clip into videos about rent, groceries, and paychecks, reminding viewers what was truly at stake. For progressives, it was validation. The frustration that had been simmering, the sense of chaos of living under constant threat of dysfunction, found a voice in Schumer's calm declaration. Ordinary Americans echoed him online. Yes, we do blame Trump. Nurses tweeted about long shifts and bills piling up. Veterans shared fears about benefits. Parents worried aloud about school lunches and childcare subsidies. His words had given their anxieties a rallying cry. The GOP response was fragmented. Some stayed silent, hoping the storm would pass. Others doubled down, accusing Schumer of fear-mongering. A few loyalists attempted spin. It's Pelosi's fault and it's the Democrats' shutdown. But their messages felt stale, drowned out by the sheer force of the viral tide. In living rooms across the country, families replayed the clip over dinner. In union halls, workers nodded in grim agreement. In classrooms, young voters dissected it between lectures, inspired by how a single line could tilt the national conversation. For a moment, politics didn't feel abstract. It felt immediate, visceral, personal. Commentators called it political theater, but for millions it was more than theater. It was proof that dignity, when delivered with clarity, could still cut through noise and lies. It was a reminder that words mattered, that truth could still land like a punch in an era of endless spin. By the weekend, the narrative was set. Editorial boards praised Schumer's composure, contrasting it with the GOP's frenzy. Social media algorithms pushed the clip higher, ensuring it crossed generational and partisan divides. Even those who rarely followed politics found themselves repeating the line, "The American people will blame Trump." It wasn't just a headline anymore. It was a mantra, a warning, a cultural stamp pressed onto the moment in bold, indelible ink. Yet beneath the headlines was a lesson about power, dignity, and the future of American democracy. When the dust settled, it became clear that this fight was never only about a government shutdown. It was about what kind of America people wanted to live in. On one side stood arrogance, the refusal to compromise, the willingness to gamble with ordinary lives for the sake of political theater. On the other stood dignity, the quiet strength to face chaos without surrendering to it, to choose principle over spectacle. Schumer's words lived beyond the moment because they crystallized a universal truth. Arrogance burns bright, but burns out quickly. Dignity, though quieter, endures. History remembers the voices that calm storms, not those that create them. In that chamber, as bluster clashed with silence, it was the silence that spoke loudest, the pause before Schumer's warning, the breath that turned into a blade. For working families, that dignity meant hope. It meant knowing someone in power understood the fear of missed paychecks, the humiliation of waiting for answers that never come, the exhaustion of being used as bargaining chips. For immigrants, it meant recognition that America's promise is not defined by one man's anger, but by the resilience of its people. For students, activists, and young voters, it meant proof that truth could still cut through noise, that cynicism hadn't completely won. Propaganda shouts, dignity whispers, and yet in the end it is the whisper that lingers. Schumer's warning was not loud, not flamboyant, not dripping with insult. It was steady, measured, undeniable, and that is why it landed. Because Americans recognize, even in divided times, the difference between theater and truth. This is the lesson carried forward. Stability is not weakness. Restraint is not surrender, and calm is not cowardice. They are the marks of leadership. In contrast, chaos and arrogance reveal themselves as hollow, thrilling in the moment but quickly empty when measured against history's judgment. The chamber will have other fights. The headlines will turn. But this confrontation reminds us that America is not defined by its loudest voice, but by its most grounded one. That when the choice is between dignity and hate, between service and selfishness, between truth and propaganda, the path forward is always lit by those who choose dignity. And if you believe dignity will always outlast hate, then this story is yours to carry forward. Schumer's words still hang in the air. The American people will blame Trump. A line delivered not as theater but as warning, a mirror held up to power, forcing the nation to confront what's at stake. This wasn't just about one shutdown, one headline, or one chamber fight. It was about whether truth still matters in America. If we ignore that warning, chaos wins. If we forget it, the same arrogance that gambles with our futures will return again and again. But if we carry it forward, if we remember that dignity cuts deeper than hate, that service lasts longer than selfishness, then this moment becomes more than a story. It becomes a turning point. That's why this channel exists, to cut through the noise, to tell the stories that matter, and to remind you that history is shaped not only by leaders in Washington, but by citizens who refuse to look away. So if you believe dignity will outlast hate, if you believe America deserves leaders who put people before propaganda, then don't just watch this story. Share it, subscribe, add your voice to the movement for truth and justice. Because this warning was not just Schumer's, it belongs to all of us now, and what we do with it will define the future.